We are live here with SCI TV. I am Joshua Gordon, the founder of the Sports Conflict Institute. I'm joined by my colleague, Maggie. Maggie, how are you today?
Hey, I'm doing great, Josh. Thanks for having me today.
And we have a special guest today, Nick Symmonds, two-time Olympian. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Nick, maybe you could begin. I think a lot of people are well aware of who you are, but it's always nice to hear in your own words how you would describe yourself.
I'm a kid from Boise, Idaho, who's lived in Oregon the last 12 years, moved to attend the university at Willamette University in 2002. I graduated with a degree in biochemistry from Willamette in 2006, and upon graduation moved down to Tracktown, USA, Eugene, Oregon, to try to realize my Olympic dream. I made the 2008 Olympic team in the 800 meters then, and then the 800 meter team in 2012 as well, and I'm currently training for the 2016 Olympic team.
And Nick, I've had the pleasure of having you in to speak to my students at the University of Oregon.
Yeah.
One of the things that became really apparent to me is not only are you prolific on the track, but off the track as well. And a lot of what interests us with the Sports Conflict Institute is taking on different issues that permeate sports. And this week in particular, we're taking on the issue of LGBT athletes. So we're hoping, with your permission, we can spend some time on there, and then of course we could talk about any of the other things that interest you as well.
Yeah, I'll start by saying, you know, most athletes are a little bit hesitant to speak out about political issues or, you know, some of their own views on controversial topics, and I think a lot of that has to do with fear of, you know, ostracizing fans or ostracizing sponsors. For me, I've always kind of viewed this running gig as a great platform and a way to not only run fast and hopefully win medals for my country, but also to try to affect some change. And in specific with regards to LGBT rights, that has been an issue that's always been very close to my heart and something that I really felt I needed to speak out on. And I think that really it started for me as an Eagle Scout with Troop 94 in Boise, Idaho. And the way that I saw the Boy Scouts of America treating gay members or gay leaders or gay scouts appalled me. And I think the beginning of my my connection with the LGBT movement came when I tweeted my displeasure with the way that they were handling gay scouting.
And Maggie, I was hoping maybe you might lead into some of this because you also have played in high-level sports, playing at Princeton basketball, and we've talked offline a bit about LGBT issues, and maybe set the tone and follow up to some of what Nick's saying as well.
Yeah, you know, Nick, it's interesting hearing you talk about your Eagle Scout experience. I was just reflecting back to my first experience when I became aware of friends who perhaps had a different sexual orientation, and then the further awareness that they were being treated differently because of that. For me, I grew up in Montana, so not too far from Boise, Idaho, but in Missoula, Montana. Nice. My first awareness was actually in college with some of my gay and lesbian teammates. But I realized just through those friendships and through that dynamic, the struggles that they encountered. Do you think that, from your experience, is it you have to be exposed and you have to have friends or relationships of some sort with people that are of that community to appreciate and fully understand what their experience is like?
That's a fantastic question, and you know, I think that as humans, we're all kind of nervous or apprehensive about the things that we're not familiar with, right? And we've seen this throughout history as we become more familiar with the community, be it through pop culture, our own personal experiences, that the taboos that were associated with that community or that demographic are suddenly not as big. You know, one thing that kind of comes to mind is, you know, the idea of African Americans in sports and what, you know, some of these amazing athletes were able to do, and now it's not even an issue. You know, or African Americans just in popular culture and what the Cosby Show did for that. But we're seeing, you know, Modern Family doing for the LGBT movement. As we become more familiar with these different demographics, we realize they're just people like us. And I've always viewed that sexuality falls on a spectrum, and that we're born with our sexuality preferences. So for someone to discriminate against someone for the way they were born, and to, you know, make them feel unwelcome just for wanting to express their love for another person, that's always been really strange to me, that someone would want to discriminate for something that seems, you know, so pure and good. You know, I haven't had a lot of experience with gay teammates or friends that are. I do have gay friends, but it wasn't necessarily for me just interacting with them on a daily or daily basis like that, or in the locker room or anything. It was just that I saw this as kind of the defining civil rights moment of our generation, and I just wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to be on the right side of history, and there's a lot of things that bother me, when it comes to our country and our culture and politics. But this one just seems like it shouldn't even be an issue. That someone would want to deny another person the right to spend the rest of their life with another person, and particularly I'm talking about gay marriage. It just seems so counterintuitive to me that we would pride ourselves on a country that values family rights and then not want to encourage people to start families together.
Now, Nick, one of the interesting things about the Olympics in general is that there's a lot written into the Olympic Charter about equality and these types of things, and at the same time, there's a lot written into the Charter about the event being completely apolitical.
Yeah.
And we had you in before the Sochi Olympics, and we were talking about what might or might not happen there, given some of what was happening from the government and suppressing gay rights in general. One, what do you think about the idea that the Olympics should be or should not be apolitical, and then also your thoughts about yourself as an athlete and how you take that on, because certainly there is a forum that these sporting events creates.
I think that in an ideal world, we would be able to put aside our differences, if only for a few weeks, and just compete for the love of the sport and for the love of country, and just, for a few weeks, just compete on the playing field rather than wage wars and political battles with each other. Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. We live in a world where the Olympics is one of the largest, sporting events, one of the largest movements that we know of, and 3 to 4 billion people tune in, and it's always going to be a political event, no matter where it's held. I remember when it was in China, it was about Free Tibet, and when it was in Russia, it was about LGBT rights, and there's always going to be, at least one, but probably multiple political and economical conflicts tied to the Olympics. So that's just the reality that we live in. The way that I found a balance for it when I was in Moscow last year, as someone who'd spoken out about LGBT rights, people wanted me to boycott the World Championships in Moscow. And I understand why they wanted me to do that. But at the same time, you got to remember that I have a job, and my job is to run fast and to hopefully win medals. I went out to Moscow having said that was my primary focus. Having won a silver medal last year at the World Championships, I then had a week in Moscow to really kind of be a tourist and to have this incredible platform to talk to international media and let them know exactly how I felt. So for me, it was kind of that balance that worked for me and allowed me to get my job done, but also, hopefully affect some change for the positive. And it was very controversial, and I had the pleasure of meeting a lot of gay people who are gay in Russia fighting these new anti-gay propaganda laws that Putin has recently passed. And they said they feel that right now, in 2013 they are treated more poorly than they were under Soviet rule, and that is just appalling. And it's really it's a fight, and it's not just a locker room fight there. This is a fight for people just to be able to walk out in the street wearing what they want to wear and saying what they want to say and holding hands with whoever they want to hold. So it was tough to see that, and to see it basically as a culture that's so far behind where we are. I know in America we still have a long way to go when it comes to LGBT rights, but those Russians that I spoke with, their fight was much farther behind ours.
Wow. So Nick, that's really interesting. So I hear the tension that you're explaining between boycotting certain events. Could have been Sochi. Folks could have felt the same way when they participated in the Sochi Olympics or World Champions. And then also, if you perform well and you get medals, then people will listen to you more. There's more of a that will actually listen to you. So do you feel like that has been the struggle for a lot of kind of premier athletes in this country when it comes to the issue of LGBT rights, this constant tension that they're kind of working with between wanting to be an advocate but also wanting to compete, perform, and as you say, do your job. You're a professional. Do your job.
Sometimes you don't want to deal with those distractions. An athlete's trained to focus on what they need to focus on and perform at a very high level. And if you're thinking in your back of your mind, if I don't win this medal or if I don't win this game, it's going to affect my ability to speak my mind. That's really hard for some athletes to deal with. You know, I've kind of always embraced that and used it to my advantage, and that I need that, you know, to push me a little harder. That it means more than just, you know, a shiny medal around my neck. It means something more than that, and that's helped me. But yeah, certainly, you know, Americans, they want to see their athletes perform, and they don't necessarily want to see their athletes speak their mind, you know, every 2 minutes. And I can't tell you how many times I've written a blog that was controversial or said something controversial, and the amount of hate that comes through in comments and social media saying, "You're just an athlete. We want to see you run. We don't care what your opinion is on this." And, you know, they have a point, I guess. I don't have a PhD in economics, and I don't have a PhD in politics, but I am a curious member of this society who, you know, reads anything I can get my hands on and engages in meaningful conversations with smarter people like yourselves who can teach me a thing or two. And I also say that I'm always open to other people's opinions. And so I don't say that I have the answers to everything. I just want to get people thinking about these topics, because I think too often we are a culture that wants to just maybe push things aside and ignore some of the harder conversations. And as athletes, you know, a lot of the athletes that I've competed with and been teammates with, we have these conversations amongst ourselves at dinner parties or when we're out running, and then it just seems like there's a cultural taboo that we're not supposed to say it when we're in front of a camera or, you know, being interviewed. And so that's always, for me, that's I understand why an athlete would feel that way, but it's not the way that I wanted to continue to run professionally.
So Nick, one of my assumptions always has been that we have lots of gay athletes that are there, but they're just not, you know, front and center, and they've kept that part of their lives in the background. And yet, Lee Steinberg, we were having a conversation with him, and he made a strong point to me that I at least thought was interesting. I wanted to get your reflection on, which was that, in fact, actually there are not nearly as many gay athletes as you might think, because the culture of sports is such that it makes it so objectionable as you're raised in sport over time that you would get weeded out because locker room culture and team culture would have enough slang and other things that make you not feel welcomed. I was interested to hear your perspective. Even though you're an individual sport athlete, you've been on teams throughout your life as well.
Yeah.
And to reflect back in what has the culture been like, and would it be such that it would make it hard for someone to want to be part of that?
And it's a really interesting idea, you know, that they would be weeded out. But I think that, you know, we see some of these athletes like Michael Sam who have made it so far in their career. One athlete that really comes to mind is Ian Thorpe, who recently came out as gay, and for years, for a decade plus, had adamantly denied rumors that he was gay because he felt that the Australian people weren't ready for their champion to be gay. You know, and I think that there's maybe certainly an aspect to locker room culture or athletics or pop culture that wouldn't allow an athlete to maybe express themselves openly. But one thing I know about professional athletes and even amateur athletes, the drive to be great is so strong that it overcomes ultimately all of those things. And certainly you're going to have to hide aspects of you. You know, even as a straight athlete, there are aspects of myself that I hide when I'm in a locker room or when I'm talking to certain other teammates. You know, I'm an agnostic, for example, and many of my teammates are adamant theists, and we get into some interesting conversations, but I know when it's appropriate to have a certain conversation with someone when it's not. And this is just the way that any demographic is, right? Whether you're an athlete or whether you're in an office or any field, there are certain things that you should be able to talk about. I'm not going to go into the locker room and necessarily run around screaming my hands in the air that I'm straight, just like I wouldn't expect one of my teammates to come running in screaming their hands in the air that they're gay. I think that the demographic of professional athletes probably very realistically mirrors the amount of homosexuals or gays that there are in the general community. So I don't necessarily agree that they would be weeded out at any point.
Yeah. That's interesting. So I was just thinking about my experience, and I don't know, Josh, maybe there is a difference between female locker rooms and male locker rooms. We certainly had quite a few lesbians on my team, and also on all of the other female teams that we knew, not just the basketball team, but the field hockey team, ice hockey team, lacrosse. But I felt like when it came to how my teammates would behave or act, it really came down to their personality and their character and not so much their sexual orientation. And I would agree with you, Nick, and I'd like to summarize what you were saying about, at the end of the day, there is this greater cause, and that's to win or to compete, and you want to perform and maximize your performance out there. And I feel like athletes are willing to work through differences, whether it's different personalities, some are shy, some are outgoing, different values, religious beliefs, as you mentioned, different sexual orientations. They're willing to rise above that to kind of reach that higher goal.
Absolutely.
Have you ever seen anyone, I think this might happen in hazing, have you ever seen anyone treated or mistreated because they were deemed to be a threat? Maybe they were really good, and perhaps someone wanted to threaten them or make them feel less so that they wouldn't perform as well. Have you ever observed any of that behavior occur?
You know, it's a little bit different. I am in an individual sport, and certainly we have teammates around us, but it's not quite the same in that we're working towards the same goal necessarily together. A lot of times we're working together, but ultimately know that we'll be competing with each other, you know, for the big meets. But you know, in terms of just like, you know, I don't want to use the word sabotage necessarily, but like, you know, trying to really fight for those moments or those positions. I personally haven't witnessed that, but you can imagine where that would certainly take place.
And Nick, there's been a couple of vignettes I've picked up that made me think a lot about not just the idea of, you know, creating a culture that's friendly for LGBT athletes to feel a part of, but even the idea of masculinity around here. Mm-hmm. And one story in particular is from a gentleman, Henry Abbott, who tells the story of Shaquille ONeal when he played basketball, and that we all know Shaq was a horrible free throw shooter, right? His hands were too big. He shot, what, like 50%, so everyone had a shot.
Yeah, on a good night.
Yeah. Well, Rick Barry spent some time with him and taught him to shoot underhand. And in practice, when he'd shoot underhand, he'd shoot somewhere around 85 to 90%.
Wow.
And you can only imagine how many more championships and points and everything else that could have done, or a few more years on his career. And at the end of the day, he refused to do it in games because he said he wouldn't shoot like a girl.
Interesting.
And so we're trying to figure out if there is, you know, in each sport, as we talk to people, if there's an analog like that where masculinity is confining, or the definition of masculinity is too confining.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't heard that, but that's really, really fascinating. And you know, what comes to mind when I hear that is, you know, Shaq's got a very, very clearly defined brand of what the Shaq brand is, and he's turned it into a multi-million-dollar brand. And I wonder if that was, you know, something that he didn't want to come off as effeminate or, you know, lose his masculinity for brand's sake, or if he just didn't want to deal with the ridicule that the fans would give him. But I tell you what, if it came down to Game 7 and the series was resting on whether or not Shaq could make a free throw, and he knew he could shoot 85 or 90% by throwing it underhand, you know, I think you put all that aside at the end of the day to win and to overcome all that. But we have this weird mix of in America that winning should supersede everything, and also you have to do it the right way and protect your masculinity and wear the right colors and behave the right way on and off the field. And it can be very hard for any player, and not just, you know, players who identify as gay or bisexual, but you know, players who identify in any different demographic that might be deemed culturally unpopular or unacceptable.
Yeah. So, you know, Nick, just thinking about that, I do think there's probably some athletes that, you know, just aren't coming out for perhaps sponsorships, perhaps some of those reasons. They just feel the pressure. Is there a forum for professional athletes to ever discuss these issues? Obviously, when it comes to the championships or the Olympics, boycott is an issue, but we talked about that earlier and why that poses a big challenge. But is there a different forum for athletes to get together and talk about serious issues, or is there not really another opportunity aside from
not that I know of? You know, what a great resource that would be for LGBT athletes to have a forum like that, where maybe some role models, you know, like an Ian Thorpe or a Michael Sam, could talk to them and just help them with the issues they're going through. I know many athletes work with sports psychologists, and I do as well. And I tell you that probably 80 to 90% of the issues we talk about have nothing to do with the actual game itself or the race itself. They more often than not have to do with my personal life and how that affects my my training. So I would encourage all LGBT athletes out there, if you're struggling in any way with the way you identify sexually, your sexual orientation, maybe a first step is talking with a sports psychologist who will keep all of that information confidential, and just working through some of those issues that you might be having in the locker room or on the field of play, or in wanting to be yourself publicly the way you live your life privately. So that's certainly always helped me. But I would love to see you know, a really concrete organization come together where athletes that are maybe struggling with that you know, that part of themselves and being able to express themselves the way they like to could come together and find some support for sure.
And Nick, I'd put in a little plug. There's an organization I started about a year and a half ago called the You Can Play Project.
Nice.
And their roots are really interesting. So it actually comes from a hockey family. A gentleman, Brian Burke, who is the head of the Toronto Maple Leafs, general manager, tough hockey culture, two sons, Patrick and Brendan Burke. And they both were playing either professional or minor league hockey. And Brendan, the youngest son, grew up in this hockey culture. The locker room's got a lot of homophobic language in it that was just a part of the culture, and nobody thought anything of it. Well, Brendan came out to his brother Patrick, and then a week later drove his car off the road and killed himself. And you know, his dad never knew during his life that he was gay. Never came out to his dad. And here's his dad, who was probably as harsh to gay athletes as anyone during his time, and did an about-face. And they formed this project called the You Can Play Project. And actually, they have a very interesting message, which is they don't go as far as, I think, where you're going, Nick, where you're talking about values and really what should be and the importance of marriage equality and all of that. They actually go a very simple message, which is just behavioral change. That there are certain things that in a workplace, like a locker room, are not tolerated, which is intolerance. And that it's about respect. It's not about whether or not you accept gay athletes or don't accept gay athletes. It's about treating each other with respect, because their thought process is that you do have a lot of religion in sports and other things in sports that create barriers to people being accepting, but behaving in a way that creates a more positive culture is their thought process. So I'm interested to see if you agree with that type of philosophy. Should we take a behavioral approach, or should we think about really creating core change in people's value structures?
I think it kind of begins with just being a little more sensitive. You know, like we say, there are people around us that we may not know that they are gay, and when we use words like faggot, or when we use words like gay to be derogatory, like, oh man, that was so gay, we aren't necessarily understanding how many people that we're hurting. And every time that person hears that, he identifies who he is, the way he or she was born as being bad, wrong, you know, in some way dirty or not appropriate. And it probably tears away at their confidence, you know, every single time they hear that. So I'll be the first one to say, you know, I grew up in a culture where gay was used pretty synonymously with bad or lame. And I must have used it 1,000 times, and I feel so bad now, you know, at the age of 30, looking back on my younger self who just was speaking, you know, the lingo that all the kids are speaking. I'm sure that there had been some gay peers of mine around me that were really hurt by that, and it took me 6 months to a year of really consciously saying, hey, you know, I need to not do that anymore, and reminding others around me to not use the word gay in a relationship that has a negative connotation. And I find that, you know, you mention it to one person once, and usually they get it. You know, they understand how hurtful that can be. And so that's step one, right? Just weeding out some of these negative connotations or negative attachments to these words in our pop culture. And then the next level of that is again becoming more familiar with gay athletes. And as more athletes come out, I think it's kind of that snowball effect, right? So you know, I'll give a shout out to my alma mater, Willamette University, and a young man named Connor Mertens, who came out recently. I think he was the first athlete that was playing for an NCAA team that had come out and identified as LGBT. He identified as bisexual, and that was huge. And then, you know, you saw Michael Sam and Ian Thorpe, and as more of these leaders come out, and we see how they're able to cross these barriers and live happy lives, very fulfilling lives, and inspire others, I think that it kind of snowballs, and pretty soon we're going to see the percentage of athletes in professional sports as identifying as LGBT mirroring the demographic of the general population much closer.
So interesting. You know, your earlier comment, Nick, you had mentioned getting some hate mail when you were voicing some opinions, but I feel like, to your last point, athletes are on the podium at all time. They are in front of people, and they are role models for a lot of folks as well. So I think it's interesting. Do you think it's more effective to have more leaders coming out and more role models, I guess, for young athletes, or do you think it's more effective to have leagues and organizations embrace kind of a rule set, an anti-discrimination rule set, or a respectful rule set? Or do you think there's a common?
I think that organizations, like the NFL and the MLB, have a responsibility to do everything they can in setting up the rules and the guidelines to discourage discrimination of any kind. They certainly have a responsibility to. And in my own world, that's just governed mostly by the IOC, there is language in there that strictly says we will not tolerate any form of discrimination based on gender, ethnicity, and what Principle 6 was fighting for during the Sochi Olympics, and I'll give the Principle 6 plug here, is to add language into the IOC charter that very clearly states that discrimination based on sexual orientation will not be tolerated either. And we fought pretty hard to have that language included before the Sochi Olympics. It was not, I don't believe. But these organizations certainly have a responsibility to make sure that discrimination of any kind won't be tolerated.
And so one of the things that has become clear to me is there's certainly a generational divide here, right, as well. When I did a talk with the Oregon football team, and I'd asked the question, well, what would you do if, one or multiple of your teammates came out as gay? And it was a non-issue for them, frankly. They're like, so what? Who cares? Whereas the coaching staff struggled with that same conversation quite a bit, right? And I think that generational divide becomes really important. So some of the question becomes, when does some of the sports leadership, right? I don't know if either of you had to have coaches who are openly gay, but where do we start putting that leadership in a position where they can not just let time take care of it, but we can expedite some of this?
Maggie?
Yeah,
Go ahead, Maggie. Yeah.
Sure. I had both my coaches. My coach in college was. We all knew she was lesbian, but she never really came out to the team and never had a conversation about it. It was kind of the non-issue that everybody knew, but no one talked about. But in stark comparison, back to your point, Josh, all of my teammates who were lesbians, we talked about it. Everybody knew. Like it was kind of the no big deal approach. But I think the more we have coaches, whether they're straight or LGBT, the more accepting they are, and the more that they make sure that they are having positive language and having positive rules and kind of something for the players to emulate, I think that's the key. If they act nervous or hesitant or unsure how to handle a player who may or may not be of the sexual orientation, players feed off that energy, and you can understand where your coach falls on an issue, even if they're somewhat silent on it. So I think the more comfortable and the more understanding coaches are, I think that will just continue the progress forward in helping the LGBT community in their acceptance. I don't know, Nick, if you have a different experience.
No, I don't have any personal experiences, but I think about the generation gap, the way you had mentioned it, and there's this somewhat morbid thought among LGBT community and supporters in that, a certain amount of the fight is just waiting for the older generation to die off, and it's a terrible thought, and I don't think that we need to wait for that to happen. I think that the older generation just needs to understand and become more familiar with the struggle and the fight. And one thing that comes to mind is, we have a president who's recently come out and said that he's in support of gay marriage. And, the other party, notably the Republicans, have said that they're not necessarily in support of it. Many Republicans don't support the idea of gay marriage. And I think it was, I can't remember his name, he was a former aide to the Bush administration that came out and said this is the exact kind of issue that should be a part of the Republican platform. Gay marriage is a conservative ideal. It's a family value ideal. And if our political leaders can't come to terms on an issue that should be viewed the same by both the left and the right, how can we expect our coaches and our athletes to come to any common ground on that? At the end of the day, this is the kind of issue that everyone should be able to see should be able to come to terms with it. It's kind of like I equate the way people used to identify that, or slave owners might have identified that slavery was okay. We as a population, I would say that 99.9% of Americans would say that that's not okay. It's not okay to own another human being. I am certain that we will get to a point in society in the future where we all just identify at 99.9% that gay marriage is just normal, you know, and it's a part of society as it should be. I hope we get there.
Well said. So, Nick, shifting gears here for a minute, because I'd be loath to have you on the show and not talk about a couple other smaller, maybe not smaller, but other issues. In the wake of the NCAA just had a major ruling on the O'Bannon case, where it talked about athletes' rights, specifically around using their image and what they could gain around profit. And it was not a complete solution in the ruling at all, but it's a topic that you've been very vocal on, about the idea of sponsorship and athlete rights, and to what extent that should or should not be taken from an individual athlete. I want to at least give you a chance here with our audience to discuss some of this, because you say it well and you say it with passion.
Certainly. Where would you like me to start, with NCAA or professional athletes?
Well, I think certainly you've been both. You've been an NCAA athlete and you've been a professional athlete, so I think whichever resonates for you, or both, touch on the topics and some of the issues, because I don't think
it's a little easier to talk about this as professional athletes, because essentially what we are is independent contractors, and we're all running our own businesses, and we have a certain expectation that our hard work will be compensated with money. And the NCAA history is not quite as linked to money; it's more linked to scholarships, obviously. But I know firsthand. I'm down here at University of Oregon occasionally, and I see how hard the football players and the basketball players and the track athletes are working. And the amount of money that they generate for their university, and the amount of money they generate for the NCAA, and the pennies that they are offered in terms of compensation, and that's not right. And I think there needs to be a radical overhaul of that whole system that allows athletes not necessarily to be paid directly, but certainly to take charge of their own brand. I mean, what if we're trying to give our athletes in the NCAA system an education in return for their hard work? Why don't we begin by educating them on entrepreneurial business and marketing, and allow them to create their own brand? So maybe the quarterback of the local football team is not getting a check every week, but is being taught a lesson in how to manage his own brand, and he's able to, start up an e-commerce site where he's able to sell his own signature products and branded items and his own jerseys. And in doing that, he's learning distribution, he's learning marketing, PR. He's getting an education that's much, much more valuable than the free scholarship that he's being offered through the university. One thing I'd like to point out that many people don't realize when they say these athletes are being compensated in the form of scholarships and a degree is that many athletes aren't actually able to pursue the course of study that they would like to study. I went to a Division III university specifically because I wanted to major in pre-med, and I ultimately got my degree in biochemistry. But when I told Division I coaches when I was being recruited out of high school that I wanted to be pre-med and I wanted to study chemistry, they shook their head and they said, not at this university. It's simply not possible with the amount of time that practice is going to take up for you to run cross-country, indoors, and outdoors. You'll have to find another less demanding degree. So these athletes are getting an education, but what kind of education are they really getting when they have to miss half their classes due to practice, or can't just study the course of study that they'd like to study? It's not right.
Wow, that's such an interesting point. I was just, again, thinking back to my experience in college. But at Princeton, they were pretty strict about academics came first before athletics. But I do know of some friends of mine that played D1 elsewhere, and I know that you could take the classes that worked around your practice schedule, or you could only take the classes that didn't interfere with the season. So, Nick, you bring up some interesting ideas for athletes, and you've seen the work that collegiate athletes put into their game and their skill set. Where do you think the NCAA should go from here? How do they start pursuing some of these options? Or do they leave it up to universities to be creative? What do you think?
That's really, really tough. As an athlete who didn't go through the D1 system, it's very difficult for me to know exactly how that should be restructured. But I guess I would just go back again to what the ideals are, and that's to give these athletes a great environment to practice their skills and become the best athletes they can be, but also to get a great education. And one thing that the coach that recruited me to Willamette said, he said, at Willamette you'll be a student athlete and not the other way around. And I think at too many D1 universities, we have athlete students. and their primary goal is to be athletes, and their secondary goal is to maybe get a degree, hopefully, if they can finish it. I think we need to make it a priority that these athletes are able to study what they want to study, are able to get the degrees that they want, are encouraged to finish. And then at the end of the day, they're students first and athletes second. And if we can invest some of the money that they're earning for the NCAA and earning for the universities in entrepreneurial business and in teaching these athletes life skills that will help them long after they're done playing, I think that we have a responsibility to do that.
Great. And Nick, as we begin to wrap up the show, any final thoughts that you want to share either on the LGBT issue or on the idea of athlete sponsorships and any of this, or anything that we haven't touched on that you just want to take a moment and share with folks as well?
We've covered a lot of different topics. Maggie, I'll let you go ahead and put your closing remarks in, and then I'll gather my thoughts.
You're on the spot, Maggie.
That's okay. No, my closing thoughts were just an appreciation and a thank you to you for coming forward. And I do appreciate and admire you for being a vocal advocate of advancing and thinking about LGBT issues. I know that there are many who probably echo your feelings, but perhaps don't vocalize them as much as you, and I admire that. I think that's a really neat thing in an athlete. And as far as NC2A, I also think there's going to be some big overhauls that need to occur in the future. But in talking with you, it's the first time I've thought of kind of different ways of thinking about education and the education that they get, and thinking about entrepreneurial opportunities in that. So you definitely have planted a seed for me to think about. So thank you for that. Yeah.
I think maybe just to my closing remarks, I thank you both for giving me this platform to speak my mind always. And I'd like to encourage other athletes who may identify as straight to maybe speak up, and it doesn't need to be going in front of national television and shouting out your two cents, but something as small as just joining Principle 6 or putting a retweet out here or there and spreading this awareness. I know it can be a bit intimidating, and you can be afraid of what backlash you might receive from friends and family, but ultimately I really believe that supporting the LGBT movement, you will be on the right side of history, and that 10 or 20 years from now you'll be very happy that you stood up for what was right, and that's equality at the end of the day.
And Nick, it'd be irresponsible of me not to allow you to share all the ways people can connect with you given our topic. So what are the ways that people can follow you, connect with you, and track all of your progress on and off the track?
Yeah, you can visit my website, nicksymmonds.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @NickSymmonds or on Instagram @NickSymmonds as well. I'm pretty vocal, pretty passionate about social media. It's been a great way for me to build my brand and to help champion the causes that I'm passionate about. I try to interact with my fans as much as possible. So I look forward to talking with anybody. And also, I've said many times I don't have all the answers. I'm just one voice. I love talking to people who have different points of view. I just encourage people to enter into these conversations with open minds. I can tell you that on many times someone's presented a logical argument to me that has ultimately swayed my opinion. And I think if we all enter into these conversations with open minds, understanding that that we can learn something from other people, then we can ultimately progress towards logical decisions.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. Maggie, thank you for co-hosting, and it was a great conversation, and we appreciate all the work that you're doing, Nick, using your athletic status as a way to bring awareness to various issues that are of importance to a lot of people out there. So thank you again, and we'd love to have you on the show again sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.